I try to propose that reality monitoring is the mechanism by which we get subjective experience. So I'm not saying that consciousness is reality monitoring. Consciousness still is subjective experience. At least my proposal is if you look into the brain, the mechanistic process that gives you subjective experience turn out to be the circuit for reality monitoring.
Welcome to Brain Science, the podcast that explores how recent discoveries in neuroscience are helping unravel the mystery of how our brain makes us human. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell, and this is episode 196. Today we'll be talking about consciousness, which has been one of my favorite topics since I launched Brain Science back in 2006. I'll be talking with Hakwan Lau, who is currently at the Riken Center for Brain Science in Japan. I recently heard Lau interviewed on Brain Inspired, and that led me to read his thought-provoking book, In Consciousness We Trust, The Cognitive Neuroscience of Subjective Experience. If you're a new listener, I recommend focusing on the big picture because this episode is more technical than most. Before we jump into this month's interview, I want to remind you that you can get complete show notes and episode transcripts at brainsciencepodcast.com. You can also send me email at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. You can get show notes automatically each month when you sign up for the free Brain Science newsletter. Just text Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. That's Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. When you sign up, you'll also get a free gift entitled 5 Things You Need to Know About Your Brain. Because Brain Science is independently produced, it relies on the support of listeners like you. You can learn more about how you can support the show at brainsciencepodcast.com/donations. As always, I will be back after the interview to summarize the key ideas, but also to talk about how this conversation relates to previous episodes about consciousness. Hakwan Lau, welcome to Brain Science.
Hi, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
I usually ask people to start out talking a little bit about themselves. And in your case, I was thinking maybe you just tell us about how you got interested in consciousness.
Oh, yes. So it was a long journey, I think about over 20 years ago. So it must be about 22 years ago when I was an undergrad in Hong Kong, actually. I was doing an undergraduate degree in philosophy and cognitive science. And that's how, mostly from the philosophy side, that I got interested in consciousness.
Was there one particular book or author that really got you going?
Yes, I think so. I was reading a lot. I had a really great teacher called Joe Lau. So he taught me a pretty comprehensive, even as an undergrad, I have a pretty good sample of the literature. But there was one book by Dave Chalmers, I think The Conscious Mind, that hard problem book that actually got me really going.
I can see the influence of Chalmers' work in some of your writing, of course. And you were also, if I remember what I read, very much influenced by Francis Crick, or inspired, I guess would be a better word.
I think that's right. I think in the end, I'm not sure I agree with either of them in substance, but I think at least back when I was an undergrad and a graduate student, those are people that I definitely looked up to and got inspired by.
Hakwan, what's the goal of your book, In Consciousness We Trust?
That is interesting because the book is somewhat written in a boring, old school kind of monograph kind of way. And I think that I really try to achieve is to fill a gap in the literature. I think there are many books out there that are very broad stroke, aimed at more like selling like a cool idea. But there is a lack of, and then there are textbooks, right? There are textbooks on consciousness, but there is something that is missing, that is in between, that is more like an academic monograph that reviews the literature and try to systematize it and try to see where we're at. So this is really how I started and what I wanted to do.
The approach you take is, and correct me if I'm wrong, obviously there are many theories of consciousness. I think I counted in Joseph Ledoux's last book that he listed at least 20 different theories.
That's all right.
Right. Yeah. So how did you make that manageable?
So I basically try to oversimplify it, and I acknowledge that from the outset. Like I try to very basically compress the entire space and get a gist out of it, and to say that there are basically two broad camps of theories. And one is what we call global theories, and they basically say that when you're conscious, pretty much your whole brain is involved. The information goes everywhere, and it makes intuitive sense. When you're conscious of something, it seems that all parts of your brain can use that information, or many parts of your brain can. And then there are some people who think, well, no, that is just cognition. If you're talking about consciousness as in the most interesting aspect of it, which is subjective experience, subjective phenomenological experience, then some people would say it's really local. So if you're visually aware of the color red, then really it's just a matter of having your visual neurons in the visual cortex firing in the right way. And from these two extremes, you can then lay out a spectrum, and presumably very few people are really that extreme on either end, although there are some. And then I would then try to evaluate the arguments for both sides and come to the conclusion that basically we should be somewhat of a centrist on that spectrum.
So obviously we don't have time to get into all the nitty gritties, but could you give us just big picture reason why you think both of these extremes fail?
Yeah, I think let's start with the local one. It's easier to see why it failed.
Right.
Yeah, because it really, if you take it to the logical bitter end, and some of those people actually do go that far, and then you basically become what we call a panpsychist. So essentially you say, well, if you cut out that piece of brain tissue that you think are really the correlates of consciousness, and if you say that is sufficient for consciousness, that means that when you take that piece of tissue out and put it on a petri dish, then it would still give you conscious experience. And some of those people strangely would say yes. Maybe they don't exactly say yes, but would say something like that would work. Or they would say like even an inactive set of logic gates, because it has those properties of these early sensory neural circuits, it would also be conscious. And then at some point you say, what about a bunch of molecules interacting with each other in some complicated way? It would have some of these properties. And then they would say, yeah, it would be conscious to some extent too. It would just be fine. It would just be a theory that as a scientist, I'm not that much interested in looking into further, because it doesn't really get us very far. And then on the global side, the people who think that consciousness is really what Daniel Dennett called fame in the brain, is information is everywhere and it gained access to all of these different parts of the brain. That does make it sound more and more like you're really just talking about cognition. You're just really talking about how the brain normally works, because there seems to be sometimes there are non-conscious processing that also seems fairly global, such as the neurological condition of blind sight. So if you have a lesion in a very restricted area in your visual cortex, some people lose the subjective experience of seeing, but the information still goes to a different part of the brain. So you can actually try to guess what stimulus stimulus is, and you can actually get it pretty accurate. You can actually dodge obstacles, and you can actually use the information, but you just lack the visual experience. So that seems to suggest that is trying to equate consciousness with global broadcast seems to be not quite right.
So then this is where things now start to get really challenging to those of us that aren't in the field. You talk about experimental confounds, and this is, I think, one of the most important themes of your book. In fact, one of the things that sets it apart from other books I've read, and especially something you call performance capacity confounder. Would you start out by, for the sake of my non-science listeners, explaining what a confound is, and then go on to explain this performance capacity confounder?
So the idea is it's very common in everyday observation as much as in experiments. So if someone tells you this might be the example I actually used in the book. If someone said we see that people eat more ice creams, and then people also go to swimming pools more often. So they swim more and then they eat more ice cream. So the two things seems to be associated. But you can't just by the fact that they're associated and say that they're one is causing the other, or one is the mechanism of the other, or they're the same, right? They are basically pretty much unrelated. They are mostly driven by this confounder that is just the heat in the summer. So just because two things are correlated doesn't really mean that there's any causal or mechanistic relationship between them. So likewise, if you say that, well, consciousness is associated with cognition or your ability to do things, then yes, most of the time this seems to be true, right? Like when you're conscious, you are presumably more able to process the relevant information that you're conscious of. But it would, I think, be a mistake to directly then say this is what consciousness is. You have to really carefully think about whether this is an ice cream and swimming situation and really see whether you can have one but not the other and try to tease them apart. So this is what we do. My job is, right, really as an experimentalist, to really try to see, well, can you sometimes have consciousness without the ability to perform? And as I hinted at earlier, in blindsight is a good case where you can basically show that you can, where at least the two things come apart. In that case, you have the lack of conscious experience, and yet you have the ability to perform. So the two cannot be the same thing. And if you take that point seriously, then pretty much, I think 95% of the published experiments are maybe not wrong, but problematic. So most of the science in the published literature has not really taken care of this kind of problems very thoroughly.
And does this impact global views or local views more or less?
I think it hurts both of them. In fact, that probably was how I got really interested in the field. When I really look at the literature, basically almost all of the experiments are, even if not totally wrong, they all suffer from this problem. So the global workspace view would look like that it would more obviously suffer, because when they say that, well, these experiments find that when you're conscious, then information seems to be broadcasted to every part of your brain. Well, in fact, I think what is more likely is just they're confounding consciousness with what I just talked about earlier, this ability to perform or ability to have a big signal in your brain, which we know is not the same as consciousness. So if you control for that, then things already look a lot less global. So part of the evidence in support of global workspace theory or global theories in general are definitely driven by these, or they have the appearance of being supported by these experiments, but the experiments are pretty flawed. Another way to think about it, if you don't want to think about experiments, you can just think someone tell you that consciousness is like fame in the brain, right? But if consciousness is mistakenly associated with the ability to do work, that is, you have a lot of information in the brain. And then, of course, having a lot of information in the brain in a very powerful and effective way would give you the false impression that it is equivalent to having the information being famous in the brain. It's just the same stuff. I mean, it's just to say that there's a lot of information going on everywhere. But that doesn't get at the issue of subjective experience. And then for the local guys, turn out the experiments are equally flawed and driven by these confounding factors. So when they say that when you're visually conscious, you have visual information in the visual areas of the brain, turns out that those experiments are also driven by a big visual signal. They're not really driven by subjective experience per se.
I want to take a moment to remind you to try TextExpander, which is my go-to app for avoiding repetitive typing and copy and paste. You can create snippets for content of any length, and it can include graphics and links. Best of all, TextExpander is available on Mac, Windows, Chrome, iPhone, and iPad. Today, I want to mention one other feature of TextExpander that I find particularly useful. Since I've been using TextExpander since before I started podcasting, I have lots of snippets, but I can easily find the right one by doing a quick search within TextExpander. Brain Science listeners can get 20% off their first year. Just visit textexpander.com/podcast to learn more about TextExpanders. That's textexpander.com/podcast to learn more and get 20% off your first year. And don't forget to tell them that you heard about it on Brain Science. You mentioned your work with Stephen Fleming's on metacognition, and I was really interested in this since I interviewed him last year. What do you think about the relationship between, let's start out with attention and consciousness, I guess, and metacognition? Those are all mixed together. How do you see that as working out?
I think attention is easier to tease apart. So when you don't attend to things, actually, let's say you're from the corner of your eyes, your peripheral vision, you can quite obviously still see things, right? So almost like conceptually, you can see that attention and consciousness are not exactly the same thing. Attention is something you do. You pay attention to certain things. Whereas consciousness, in the sense of subjective experience, is almost something that happens to you. If you feel something, it's beyond your control, right? Whereas attention is up to your control. Sorting that out is easy, I think. And it's one of those things that is true in the past few decades ago. I think people would lump them together because I think mostly because people don't want to talk about consciousness because it's such a messy thing to talk about. And then they just sometimes call it attention or something like that. They'll say conscious attention. So sorting that out was not so difficult. And in fact, almost conceptually, you can do it without experiment. And for metacognition, it's a bit more tricky. I think it's more controversial. Some people would say that they're the same thing. I actually don't. Sometimes people think that because a lot of people think that Stephen Fleming and I would argue that metacognition is a huge part of consciousness or a major mechanism for consciousness. That is true, but it doesn't mean that they're the same thing. And in particular, I think we are both arguing that only some form of metacognition might be relevant. So if you are now thinking about your own thoughts, that is very interesting, but that is not how subjective experience come about, because when you don't think about them, as I said, your subjective experience still arises and it still occurs to you. So it's certainly not that kind of normal, everyday self-introspection that is relevant. And we think I think it's a kind of very implicit form of metacognition that is important. And by implicit, that is automatic. It happens to you without you wanting it to happen. So then the issue is, why do we still call it metacognition? Why is it is some sort of self-monitoring. And I think that gets a little theoretical as why we call it that way. Yeah.
Stephen did a really good job, I thought, of it in his book of explaining how there's building blocks of metacognition that are automatic that basically that we share with other animals. And we have those building blocks that then build onto the metacognition that we are able to do, some of which may be conscious and some of which may not. You also spend quite a bit of time in your book talking about something called inflation as an alternative to the filling in explanation for why we don't see things like the blind spot. Would you tell us about inflation and why you think it's a valuable alternative or complement to filling in?
So inflation relates to what we talked about earlier about the potential dissociation or the, maybe not potential, but the actual dissociation between attention and consciousness, right? So it's a good case. You think about your peripheral vision. So if you don't think about it analytically, you would think that you basically see things in your peripheral vision, color in your peripheral vision, right? The whole world looks to you as somewhat uniform and colorful, maybe a little bit more detailed in the center, but the peripheral is not like completely grayscale or very pixelated, very coarse-grained. But that doesn't sit so well with all the biology we actually learn, right? Because on the human retina, if you actually do go back to your anatomy class, it says that most of the color-sensitive cells are really in the center. The cone cells are in the center. So in the periphery is mostly rod cells. It has a tiny bit of color sensitivity, but not really that much. So your peripheral should be, in a sense, if there are some Martians who come to our planet and started dissecting human eyes and try to study what our vision would be like, I think the Martians would probably predict that our color vision is pretty poor in the periphery. And in fact, behaviorally, we are pretty poor. It's not like completely colorblind in the periphery, but we are fairly bad at doing fine-grained color judgment. In terms of spatial resolution, based on what we understand about the brain, the peripheral is also pretty poor. It's a very low spatial resolution. But things don't look so grainy. And so there's a sense that things are inflated. And inflation, of course, now took on a new term as actual economic financial inflation is hitting us. But it's a similar idea that things are not worth so much in your periphery, but the currency seems to be higher. There's a sense that subjectively we inflate and fool ourselves into believing how much we actually see in the periphery. So now some people would say that this is interesting account, but why is it not just filling in, right? Maybe the peripheral color is being filled in. So in the book, we argue that, well, it is not the case, because filling in usually means that you actually fill in some detailed color in the back to the, let's say in your visual cortex, you just constructed color. But I would say the evidence is more like you never construct any detailed color, but you just somehow convince yourself that there is some color there, and you never actually fill in the specifics. You're trying to, let's say, fill in your timesheets for your employer to say what work you've done, so you can actually made up some task and some hours, right? You can fill in the details. That's filling in. But you can also do inflation and just basically write a statement. You trust me, I've done a lot of work. Just pay me. Like you can also say it to your boss. If you have a very understanding boss, you can do that. And I think in the case of consciousness, your peripheral vision is more like the kind of inflation. It never fill in the details. It just bluff and convince yourself that you have some details there.
So why does this matter?
It matters in two ways. Well, first of all, it even further trivializes the distinction between attention and consciousness. Because there you almost have not just a dissociation, you have basically a negative relationship. Because your periphery has lack of attention, and yet it is inflated. It has a high intensity of subjective experience, higher than what the information content is worth. So it's really the two kind of go opposite, less attention, but more subjective experience. And the other issue, why is it important? It supports the kind of intermediate account that I want to argue for. So the subjective experience cannot be a local matter. If it's a local matter, you don't have the information in your periphery. And because it's not being filled in, you just shouldn't have that much subjective experience. And on the other hand, it's also not quite global, because you also don't really have the information at your global access. If I actually suddenly challenge you to, name the colors of individual locations in your periphery, you're pretty poor at doing that. So it's something like in between. It is not local, and it probably requires some sort of self-monitoring that is somewhat higher level. But the self-monitor is not to broadcast the information. The self-monitor just convince yourself, just try to tell yourself how much information you have. And it makes sense for the self-monitor to cheat a little bit there, because in your periphery, even though you don't have the information right now, you just have to move your eyes a little bit. And you know that the world actually is colorfully uniform. So your self-monitor basically learns this heuristic or trick to constantly lie to yourself and say, well, just trust me, like the periphery is actually pretty vivid, even though it isn't. But when you make an eye movement and actually look at the periphery, it will be vivid. So even though you don't have the information, it makes sense for you to lie to yourself and say you almost have it.
Episode 200 of Brain Science is scheduled for September 2022, and I would love to include your feedback. If you want to be part of this milestone episode, just email me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com to get more information. I will need all submissions by August 31st, 2022. I've managed to get us halfway through the interview without asking you about your theory, but we needed that background information. Your approach falls into the broad category of a higher order theory. So perhaps you should start by just telling my listeners what a higher order theory is as a class. And then if you want to tell them about your approach.
Yeah, so it's kind of philosophical theory. It comes from philosophy. You can trace it back to Immanuel Kant, in recent times, David Rosenthal, all these philosophers. But the idea is not much more than what I just already told you, is that you have some sort of self-monitoring mechanism. And the monitoring mechanism is implicit. We're not talking about really paying conscious effort and attention to monitor yourself. We're talking about some sort of automatic procedures in your brain that constantly operate itself. And essentially, it basically just look at the sensory signals in your brain and decide whether those signals are conscious or what they mean. That is the idea, and I think my contribution to it, if you will, but it's just to link this kind of philosophical theory to neuroscience as well as to computational models. So the idea of the self-monitor traditionally in higher order theories is talked about in a kind of, I shouldn't say imprecise, it's very precise, but it is in a very conceptual way. They would say these are higher order representations and higher order thoughts or higher order perceptual processes. But people don't really know what they mean, I think, unless you are really in the know in the philosophy literature. And my task has been to break it down and say, well, it's self-monitoring. And then you ask, as a cognitive neuroscientist, why do you need this self-monitor? So what I mean is, as a cognitive scientist, what we ask is often the question of, okay, so this is the brain circuit and you label it as something, right? Like a piece of memory or something. Can you tell me in mechanistic terms, almost borrowing the terminology from computer science or electrical engineering, what this circuit is doing? So in this case of self-monitoring, I can say, well, this is basically like a route or interpreter of the signal. So you have some perceptual signal. Let's say you have some neurons in the visual cortex that says that there's a red apple in front of you. And that's good. But usually those signals are not so detailed. They only said red apple. It doesn't say in front of you or in front of you right now. So some self-monitor, that higher order process, which I think is critical for consciousness, is exactly doing this further interpretation. So if you have a visual signal that says red apple, and then the higher order guy, the self-monitor, would say, well, this signal that says red apple is reflecting the state of the world right now, which means that it is not your own imagination, for example, because when you imagine a red apple, the same signal also gets triggered. So you have a self-monitor that kind of determines what is the source of the signal. It is actually coming from the external world right now. It is not imagined by yourself. And it can also do other things like to make sure whether it's just noise, because sometimes your neural signal also have a spontaneous noise that might cross a certain level. So that is the number one, the primary function of that interpreter or the self-monitor. Once that recognizes the source of a signal, it also routes the signal to the appropriate places, right? Because if it's imagined by yourself, it should have a very different consequence compared to when it is actually triggered by the external world. So that's what the self-monitor does in a computational sense. So when you actually want to build a circuit like that, it would make sense for you to insert this self-monitor.
And this is based on experimental evidence. So the difference between, say, this approach, you call this perceptual reality monitoring, right? That's PRM. The difference between this and, say, some of the same experimental evidence would be acknowledged by somebody like Stanislas Dehaene, but the difference is that they would say that this process is going on in parallel to consciousness, whereas you're saying it's an important hierarchical element. Is that accurate?
That's true. Yeah, that's right. I think that the parallel hierarchical distinction is maybe more technically complicated, but I think at least the first stroke, I think the difference between me and what you mentioned, like Stanislas Dehaene, the kind of global workspace framework, is that they think that this higher order process is just to broadcast the signal everywhere. And we think it's not as simple as that, because if it's broadcasting everywhere, then every time you're conscious, you should have a powerful ability, a strong capacity to do tasks. And in your peripheral vision is a good case of not the case, right? Because you seem to have a subjective sense of experience, but you don't really have the information. Or blindside would be the reverse. You lack the subjective experience, but you seem to have the information processing capacity. So we think Stan's model is not right. The global workspace model is not right. And rather, it's more like what I just said. It's just a router. And the router can make errors. So when you dream is a good example. The signal certainly is not coming from the external world when you dream, but presumably when you dream, the router is making all these errors and misattributing your spontaneous internal visual activity as if it's reflecting the state of the world right now.
Could you be a little bit more concrete for my listeners about how your theory is different from a global theory like Stan's? I know you have said this, but I'd like you to re-say it just because it's so important.
I'll put it this way, the local theories assume that consciousness pretty much have no function. It doesn't do anything. It's just an experience. And once you're dissociated from function, then you would basically, some of them end up assuming that even molecules are conscious because it doesn't have to do anything. And I think that's a little wild. And then for global theories, they would think that consciousness has all the functions. Right? Consciousness is important for you to pay attention, important for you to think, important for you to do anything complicated. Because consciousness for them is global broadcast. Without global broadcast, of course, the information stays pretty limited, right? So its consciousness is to amplify and send a signal everywhere. So my view is that it is functional. So consciousness has a function, but the function is not that obvious because of all these cases of dissociation, like peripheral vision or blind sight I talk about. So it must be functional. It's not like a metaphysical thing. It is a computational process in the brain. So it's functional in that sense. But it's not just to boost the signal to be bigger and better and stronger. So it doesn't come with that kind of function, but it comes with something more subtle. It allows you to do exactly reality monitoring. So when you're consciously seeing something, in fact, that experience tells you that your visual signal is reflecting the state of the world right now, which may seem so obvious that you don't think about it, but it is actually quite important to know that this signal is reflecting the state of the world right now rather than reflecting my own imagination. Because the breakdowns of that or the confusion of that would be, in a not so harmful case, would be dreaming. In a more harmful case will be psychosis, right? If you confuse your own imagination versus externally incoming perceptual signals. So it has that function. It's a very specific function. It's not like global theories, which would basically say it is associated with almost all the important cognitive functions.
So how does your theory differ from the main, I apologize that this might not be the right word, but the more well-known theories, the more well-known higher order theories?
Yeah, so it's really not that different. I think the biggest, there's some insider fights between us. Let's put it this way. I think most of the higher order guys are philosophers. And then Joe Ledoux, I think, would now identify himself as a higher order guy as well. He focuses more on emotion. So we co-author papers together. I think it's through that kind of exercise we know the difference is if you focus on emotion, you really think a lot more about, you're actually much more higher order in a sense. I mostly study simple perceptual experiences. And in those cases, the sense of self does not really become, so if you see red, you see red. You don't think about your relationship with red as being so prominent. But whereas if you're thinking about emotions, then certainly I think Joe Ledoux has a point that fear is something bad happening to you, right? Is a sense of danger of something happening to you. And other emotions are very self-involving. So in a sense, my theory compared to Joe's is more simplistic. It's more mechanistic almost. It doesn't involve all this self and all this schema. So we've been trying constantly to see how we can merge the two together, or maybe mine is more primitive, but when it comes to emotions, more things are added on top, etc. So mine's more like a simplest case of what a simple conscious experience could be. And compared to my philosopher friends, the difference is really just mine is in more computational or neuroscience terms. The content may not be that different. Except for one point, I think that we do debate. I think I might be the only one who think that, is that I think the self-monitor itself does not actually have to have the content of consciousness. So what I mean is the content, let's say when you're seeing a red apple, the content might still be in the visual cortex. And your self-monitor basically just said, well, that piece of information over there is reflecting your own imagination rather than the current state of the world, something like that. So it doesn't have to actually duplicate that information. So that means that your different part of the brains more work together to give rise to consciousness. Whereas I think for most of the other higher order people, they would think that the information could be extracted from the higher order monitor itself. So you should be able to read out your entire content of consciousness from your prefrontal cortex, for example. I'm not sure that's true. We haven't been able to sort it out entirely yet.
You also in your book write that you consider yourself a functionalist. Will you explain what that is? What's functionalism?
So within philosophy, that is not necessarily the most popular view these days, but I basically think that you can account for all mental functions, all mental processes. The nature of all of that, like pain, sorrow, happiness, memory, motor control, any mental whatever, I think you can explain in terms of the computations that your brain performs. So pain is nothing but a kind of computer program giving you a signal that some disturbance is happening in a bodily location that is potentially damaging. So that you can actually write down, you can translate all of these mental functions into basically a software problem. All of these are software, so the hardware doesn't really matter. And that, I think, is one way to describe what functionalism really is, at least the form of functionalism that I defend. So basically to say everything is software. So when you recognize a person, it's just some neurons implementing a computer program. Basically, it could have been in any implemented by any other substrate. The physical substrate doesn't matter. It's really the computation that determines what the psychological functions are. And some people don't believe that. Some people think that the physical substrate really matter. So you can't just replace neurons with silicon chips. And even if you keep the circuit the same, so long as the physical substrate is being replaced, it won't be exactly the same thing.
What are the deficits in your perceptual reality monitoring theory as it currently exists?
I try to address it in the last part of the book. I wasn't very happy about one fact, which is it all seems very mechanistic, which I like. And it seems to explain when you're conscious and when you're not conscious. So when your self-monitor determines that this signal reflects the state of the world rather than noise, then you're conscious. But it doesn't tell you exactly the qualitative character of the experience. By which I mean, red looks a certain way and green looks a different way. They're different in a very specific way. So if it's just information, if it's just so red is a wavelength and green is a wavelength, they're just different. And if it's just like that, you should be able to basically swap them. It doesn't matter, right? So they're just different. But red looks a certain very specific way. Red looks reddish, green looks greenish. And it's not something that is easy to explain within that framework. And in the last chapter, I speculate a bit how we can extend my theory to address that as well.
And you're also working with Ledoux on the missing element of emotions. So one of the interesting themes that really kind of runs throughout your book is an out-and-out attack on panpsychism. And let me be upfront and say, I don't think panpsychism makes any sense either. So I have my own bias. But would you explain from a scientific standpoint why you see panpsychism as a problem?
Couple of things, right? One is that so panpsychism is the idea that consciousness is everywhere, and even my table in front of me might be conscious to some degree. I think the problem is just that it's not really testable or falsifiable. You can say it is, like how do you, and I don't think it is, and they will say you don't think it is, but it is. But there's just no measurement at the end of the day to resolve the difference. Whereas if you say that a person is conscious or not conscious, well, you can ask the person. There's usually some behavioral signs that you look at me, I look conscious to you, and if you hit me and I say ouch, and you would probably infer that I'm actually experiencing pain. It's not just a programmed reflex, right? You can basically infer based on the behavioral responses. By saying the tables and some atoms and some molecules can be conscious, you're basically saying that you don't need behavioral evidence anymore, so long as your theory says that it's conscious, it is. And once you do that, I think you're really on a very slippery slope to something that is more like authoritative pseudoscience rather than empirically driven science. It's really up to the theory. And the theory, of course, is always associated with some powerful luminaries in the field who have very strong opinions about how things should look. And And it really comes down to opinions. They think that this sphere is right and therefore this table is conscious. And you have to believe it, even if there's no evidence for that. And I think it just rubs me the wrong way. I mean, every bones of me as a scientist just says, no, this is closer to authoritarianism than science.
Hakwan, there's one thing that I'm a little confused by, and that is, you start out the book with what is now, I think, the fairly accepted definition of consciousness, which is subjective experience. But then you finally come down on a theory that basically adds reality monitoring. And I'm not really sure I understand how you got from A to B. Why do you feel it's so important to add this reality monitoring to almost to your definition of consciousness at the end?
Yeah, I would say I didn't just add it in like that. It's more like I try to propose that reality monitoring is the mechanism by which we get subjective experience. So I'm not saying that consciousness is reality monitoring. Consciousness still is subjective experience. At least my proposal is if you look into the brain, the mechanistic process that gives you subjective experience turned out to be the circuit for reality monitoring.
So what else would you like to share before we close?
There was a chapter, the second last chapter, where I talked about another kind of consciousness, which is, in fact, somewhat of redemption that I try to make. Because when I started out in the field, I read all these philosophers, and it relates to your question earlier about subjective experience. That is, by now, seems to be the accepted definition amongst the current active scholars in the field. Like if you study consciousness, you really want to get at how subjective experience comes about. But there is a longer history before that wasn't like that. So consciousness also, of course, has another connotation used in social sciences as well as in clinical psychology that refers to something quite different. Consciousness is really more like your rational grasp of reality, the narrative of reality. So that's why, the Freudians talk about consciousness in a totally different way. They don't really mean subjective experience. They mean something more like your rational access to your version of reality. And the sociologists, of course, also talk about consciousness, like false consciousness, collective unconsciousness, and the different theories in the social sciences have talked about. And I think that notion is also interesting. In my book, I think I didn't do so well. I tried to cover it and tried to talk about how it's related to our subjective experience. And that's why the reality monitoring theory kind of comes about. Even if you take consciousness to be subjective experience, maybe reality monitoring is the mechanism involved. And maybe from there, you can link up the notion of subjective experience to this older and broader notion of basically our rational grasp of reality. It's something that maybe I shouldn't end it with this soundbite, but it's more like this is something of an unresolved business for me. And I think people who are puzzled by this should rightfully feel puzzled because the literature right now does not really cover this very well.
Do you have any advice for students who are interested in studying consciousness?
Yes. I would tell them that most of the current work isn't very good, including mine. And when I started out, my doctoral advisor also told me the same thing. And I think I somehow went exactly the opposite way that he wanted me to, because I think if the field is not very good, I can go and fix it. I don't think it's so easy, but I think people should be aware that there's a lot of excitement around the field because the topic is so interesting and there's a lot of media attention. But it doesn't mean that our science is doing very well. In fact, I think we should take a more humble approach and acknowledge that we're not doing very well yet. So if you want to join the field, this is not going to be all sunny. It's actually quite rainy and dark sometimes, and we should be prepared for that.
Well, that certainly is a sobering thought. But at least now people can say, hey, I want to study consciousness, and they don't necessarily have to become a philosopher. There is a science, even if the science is primitive and flawed, you have to start somewhere.
I mean, it's a long way, and we sometimes see some setbacks, but I think overall there's been progress.
Are you familiar with Patricia Churchland's work?
Yeah, I read some of her work. Yeah, I'm a big fan. Yeah.
So, I mean, I interviewed her a long time ago, and of course, she's emeritus professor at this point of her career. But she told me, when she started out, it was not even considered a valid science topic. She became a philosopher because she was interested in consciousness, and science wasn't ready to look at consciousness yet. So I'm enjoying interviewing people like you and Anil Seth, who belong to this new generation where it is a topic that you can choose to study. So I think that's exciting. Flaws and all, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today.
Yes, it's been really fun. Thank you.
First, I want to thank Hakwan Lau for taking the time to talk with us about his new book, In Consciousness We Trust, The Cognitive Neuroscience of Subjective Experience. This book is really aimed at workers and students in the field of consciousness research. So I think it's important to emphasize this interview provided a very superficial overview of Lau's work. Every month, I remind critical listeners to read the entire book. I don't expect most of you will feel compelled to do this, but you should if you're interested in working in this field. Those of you who are long-time listeners no doubt realize that many of Lau's viewpoints differ significantly from many previous guests. So I'm going to take a different approach to this episode's summary. I will start with a summary of the key ideas that Lau shared, but I will also contrast his ideas with several other approaches. I will try to be very clear when I'm expressing my personal opinion. One overriding theme of Lau's book is to take a critical stance toward the current state of consciousness studies as a scientific discipline. On Brain Inspired, Lau complained that there are too many theories, and in his book, he complains that the media inflates the importance of certain theories because they are championed by established authorities. One of his main targets is Panpsychism, which I won't have time to talk about in this summary. The logic of the interview was intended to follow the structure of his book, so he started out by talking about the fact that he sees most theories as variations on two main extremes, global approaches and localist approaches. An extreme local view places subjective experience in the sensory cortex, while the well-known global workspace theory says that consciousness requires a widespread broadcast of information. Of course, there's no one who currently says that this requires the entire cortex, which would be the logical opposite of the extreme localist view. However, Lau's main point is that neither view accounts for all the experimental data, which he says implies the need for a more centrist view. He proposes what he calls the perceptual reality monitoring theory, PRM for short, which is an example of a higher order theory of consciousness because it involves hierarchical information processing. The key point he made in the interview was the proposal that reality monitoring is the mechanism by which we get subjective experience, not that consciousness is reality monitoring. Consciousness is subjective experience, but his proposal was that if you look into the brain mechanisms, the processes that give you subjective experience turn out to be the circuits for reality monitoring. To be perfectly honest, I did not find his argument persuasive. I can see how reality monitoring is important to metacognition and even to our ability to know the difference between real-time experiments and imagination. But my biggest problem with Lau's approach is that not only does it fail to explain the qualitative nature of conscious experience, but it also restricts consciousness to a limited number of mammals. And this is not because he accepts Ledoux's argument that we can't know if animals are conscious, but because he limits consciousness to animals that appear to have the necessary cortical circuitry to implement his perceptual reality monitoring. I invited Lau onto brain science, not because I agree with everything he said, but because I want to provide a sense of the diversity of voices among those who are trying to understand how the brain generates consciousness. The one thing that all my guests have in common is that they believe that consciousness requires the brain and that it is a legitimate area of scientific endeavor. Lau is quite critical of the work of others in the field. Such criticism is an important part of any scientific endeavor. If your theory doesn't stand up to the withering criticism of other scientists, you should not be sharing it with the rest of the world. One important point he made was that experimental confounders are always a challenge. Let me give you a real-life example of a confounder. When the Omicron variant of COVID emerged, there were widespread claims that it was less virulent. However, given that it arose in the context of vaccination, this claim was dubious from a scientific standpoint. Subsequent statistical analysis has supported what many clinicians suspected all along. Omicron was only less severe among vaccinated people. Vaccination is an example of a confounder that needed to be considered. In his book, Lau emphasizes two other points about confounders. One is the importance of recognizing them, and the second is the importance of converging evidence. This means that if you have several different experimental approaches with different confounders and they converge on the same conclusion, it helps overcome confounders that can't be removed. I hope the example I gave you from medicine can give you a better sense of why recognizing confounders is so important. In his book, this seems to be one of Lau's primary arguments against global neuronal workspace theory. His take on DeHaan's work does not always match what I took away from reading DeHaan's book, Consciousness and the Brain, Deciphering How the Brain Codes Our Thoughts, which I described briefly in episode 160. But I would rather concentrate on several bigger issues. One is that all the theories considered by Lau are what Mark Solms, who I interviewed in episode 184, would call cortical-centric. This may be why he has difficulty incorporating both the qualitative aspect of consciousness and emotions. Antonio Damasio has famously come around to accepting the late Jacques Panksepp's claim that both emotion and consciousness begin subcortically. This has huge implications for answering the question of which non-human animals are conscious. I refer you back to episode 128 when I talked with the co-author of a book called The Ancient Origins of Consciousness, which argued that all vertebrates, and maybe even insects, have primary sensory consciousness. Obviously, this is beyond the scope of today's episode, but it should be noted that even those who restrict the possibility of consciousness to mammals are beginning to recognize the role of subcortical circuits. The other objection I have to Lau's approach is his functionalism. He never acknowledges the role of the embodied cognition movement. This contrasts sharply with his contemporary Anil Seth, who was interviewed last year in episode 188. I have no allegiance to any particular theory of consciousness, but based on my reading, a credible theory must include findings from outside the narrow confines of consciousness studies. It must accommodate the evidence that many processes that were once considered conscious, for example, visual processing, are largely unconscious. Maybe there isn't such a sharp divide between consciousness and other brain processes like we once assumed. A credible theory must also include the role of embodiment and the fact that emotions are fundamental to having subjective experience. These ideas also impact the questions that appear at the end of almost every book about consciousness. Are animals conscious? Could computers become conscious? It is extremely rare for me to criticize the position of my guest, but I hope that given how openly Lau criticizes his colleagues, he will not be offended. I do not claim to keep up with all the literature in this or any other subfield of neuroscience. I rely on academic texts to give me an overview of the current issue. With that in mind, I highly recommend In Consciousness We Trust, the cognitive neuroscience of subjective experience to students and anyone else working in the field. I'd love to hear your feedback about this episode. You can write to me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. Especially if you are new to brain science, I recommend going to brainsciencepodcast.com for the complete show notes and episode transcript. In the show notes, I have listed some key references from Lau's book, as well as a partial list of previous episodes of Brain Science about consciousness. I particularly recommend episode 160 through 163 for a detailed overview of current theories about consciousness. While you're there, please sign up for the free Brain Science newsletter, or you can text Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. Then you'll get the show notes automatically every month, along with a free gift entitled 5 Things You Need to Know About Your Brain. So you can just text Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. Brain Science is independently produced, which means it relies on the support of listeners like you. You can learn more about how to support the show at brainsciencepodcast.com/donations. One last thing, I'm hoping to post episode 200 in September of 2022, and I'd like to include listener feedback. If you'd like to be a part of this, just email me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com for the details. Next month's episode will be an encore of my interview with Evan Thompson, one of the pioneers of the embodied cognition movement. I intend to record a new episode summary that considers what we have learned since that interview was recorded. Until then, I hope you'll check out my other podcasts, Books and Ideas, and Grain Rainbows. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to talking with you again soon. Brain Science is copyrighted by Virginia Campbell, MD. You may share the show with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please write to brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com for permission. The theme music for Brain Science is Mindfire, written and performed by Tony Catraccia. You can find his work at syncopationnow.com.